Asterisk. Have you ever bitten into something so delicious that you didn't dare ask what was in it? In 1854, a quiet Louisiana town welcomed two mysterious sisters with open arms and empty stomachs. Their pies were legendary, rich, tender, unforgettable. But behind every bite was a secret, one the townsfolk would discover far too late. Tonight, we'll step into the misty streets of the Bayou, where hunger, trust, and terror collided. You'll hear whispers of missing travelers, the strange deliveries under moonlight, and the night the sisters invited the entire town to dinner. A feast no one would ever forget. This is not just a story about food. It's about survival, about the thin line between kindness and killing. So before we serve this tale, make sure you subscribe to the channel, given this video a like, and shared it with someone who loves a chilling mystery. Because once you hear what really happened, you'll want to warn the world. Now, let's meet the sisters who served more than meat. Asterisk. Louisiana, 1854. The morning fog clung to the bayou like a shroud, muffling the world in pale gray silence. The first sound to disturb it was the groan of wooden wheels grinding against the damp dirt road. A lone carriage emerged from the mist, its frame weather-beaten, the black paint dulled by time and travel. Two women sat inside. Their faces were hidden beneath wide mourning veils, the kind worn by widows who never quite stepped out of grief. When the carriage came to a halt in front of the abandoned riverside inn, they stepped out without a word. One was tall and slender, the other shorter, but with a presence that seemed heavier somehow, as if she carried invisible weight in her very bones. They didn't glance at the small gathering of townsfolk watching from across the street. They didn't greet the sheriff, who tipped his hat in awkward welcome. Instead, they walked straight to the inn's front door, unlocked it with a key that no one had seen them receive, and disappeared inside. The door shut with a soft click. The town exhaled a slow, cautious breath. The waiting town. This was Belmar, a place where news traveled faster than the river current. In summer, you could smell gumbo cooking 3 streets away. In winter, you could hear the old church bell echo across the bayou even when the fog smothered everything else. But that morning, Belmar was still, too still. It was the kind of quiet that felt like the town was holding its breath, waiting for something. Gossip and speculation. By noon, every chair in Claudine's cafe was full. Over cups of chicory coffee and plates of cornbread, the talk turned, as it always did, to the new arrivals. Widows, someone muttered, tapping ash from a cigar. Widows don't rent the old Mercier place, another replied. That inn's been empty since the river took Monsieur Mercier. They're sisters, Claudine herself chimed in, wiping her hands on her apron. Same hair, same eyes. Green as river moss. Or witches, old Baptiste LeBlanc whispered, leaning in close. His breath smelled faintly of whiskey, though it was barely past breakfast. I've seen the signs, black dresses never smile, and they arrived on a Friday. Theories spread as quickly as they formed. Daughters of a ruined French nobleman, runaway wives from New Orleans, even whispers that they'd been seen at a funeral in Baton Rouge before the man in the coffin had died. The truth, of course, was none of these. But no one in Belmar knew that yet. The shop opens. 1 week later, the sisters reopened the inn not as lodging, but as a bakery and butcher shop. The sign above the door was freshly painted in a dark maroon. Les Soeurs Boucher, the Butcher Sisters. The first morning they opened, the scent of baking bread and roasting meat wafted through the entire Riverside district. It was rich, intoxicating, the kind of smell that makes your stomach twist with want. They sold meat pies that crumbled like butter in your hands. The crust was golden and flaked apart at the slightest touch. The filling was perfection. Tender, savory, unlike any pork, beef, or game the townsfolk had tasted before. Sheriff Dupuis bought 2 pies, just to be polite, and returned an hour later for 4 more. Even Claudine, who prided herself on her cooking, admitted she'd never tasted anything so rich. Within days, the sister shop was the busiest place in Belmar. But then came the nights. The daytime brought warmth and the smell of baked bread. The nights brought something else entirely. Children whispered of seeing lanterns flicker in the upstairs windows long after midnight. A fisherman swore he'd seen the taller sister walking along the riverbank at 2 in the morning, dragging something heavy through the mud. And then there was the smell, not the warm, welcoming scent of the pies. This was sharper, metallic, tinged with something sour. It drifted from the back of the shop on certain nights, clinging to the damp fog. Those who caught a whiff would wrinkle their noses and walk faster. The boy who saw too much. One evening, 12-year-old Emile Rousseau was sent by his father to fetch a loaf of bread before the shop closed. The streets were nearly empty, the sun just sinking behind the Bayou trees. When he reached the shop, the front door was locked, with a faint glow of lantern light bled through the cracks in the shutters. Curious and a little reckless, Emile crept around the side of the building to the narrow alley that led to the cellar door. He crouched low, peering through the gap in the wooden fence. That's when he saw her, the shorter sister, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, her hands gripping the end of a large, limp sack. The bottom of the sack dragged along the dirt, leaving a dark trail in its wake. It was heavy enough that she paused twice to adjust her grip. The sack moved. Not much, just a slow, twitching ripple, like something inside was shifting weakly. Emile's breath caught in his throat. The sister reached the cellar, pulled the door open, and without hesitation, hauled the sack down into the darkness below. When she came back up, her hands were empty. She closed the door, latched it, and stood for a moment in the moonlight. Her face was expressionless, her eyes pale green, catching a lantern glow, flicked once toward the fence where Emile hid. He didn't breathe until she went back inside. And from that night on, Emile never ate the sisters' pies again. But the rest of Belmar? They couldn't get enough. Narrator's question for the audience. What would you do if the sweetest scent you'd ever smelled came from the darkest place in town? By the second month, Les Soeurs Boucher was no longer just a shop. It was a place in Belmar. The old Riverside Inn, once a sagging relic with warped shutters and broken glass, now glowed warmly at all hours. Its windows breathed steam and scent into the street, pulling customers in like moths to a lantern. Men from the docks stopped there before heading home, their pockets light, but their arms heavy with parcels. Women came for the bread but lingered over tea, their conversations punctuated by sighs of pleasure at the first bite of a meat pie. Even the church elders who had once muttered about worldly indulgences began appearing more often, purely for the food, of course. It wasn't just that the sisters' recipes were good. They were irresistible, the taste of something unnamed. The crust of their pies was as delicate as spun silk, shattering in layers that melted on the tongue. The fillings were rich and earthy, the meat slow-cooked until it yielded to the slightest pressure. Customers would close their eyes with the first bite, their lips glistening, their breathing slowing, as if savoring something almost intimate. People left the shop flushed, dreamy-eyed, and just a little too quiet. Some swore they felt stronger afterward. Others claimed they hadn't been hungry for hours, even until the next day. The curse whispers. But not everyone was enchanted. In the dim corners of Claudine's cafe, the oldest residents of Belmar exchanged wary glances. They remembered the last time the Mercier Inn was full of life. That was 30 years ago, when Monsieur Mercier ran it as a lodging house. Back then, travelers came through Belmar often, until they began disappearing. They never found the bodies, old Baptiste muttered one rainy afternoon, his gnarled fingers tracing the rim of his glass. Just their horses tied up out back. Same stable we got now. Curse, said Claudine, pouring his drink. Or bad men. Maybe bad men and a curse. It was the kind of talk no one wanted to believe, but everyone remembered, the kind that clung to a place like damp to stone. The hunter's story. The unease deepened one foggy morning when a hunter named Louis Dupre came into town, mud clinging to his boots and eyes darting like a man who'd seen something wrong. He stopped in front of the sheriff's office, wiping his brow before speaking. Something's taking the livestock, he said. Hogs, goats, not just mine, for farms in the last month. The sheriff frowned. Bears. Louis shook his head. No blood, no tracks. Just gone. Fences still locked, like they vanished. What are you saying? Louis hesitated. I'm saying animals don't just walk away, and people don't either. The butcher's ledger. The strangest part, some noticed, was that the sisters never seemed to buy meat from the local butcher. Pierre Marchand, who supplied every other household in Belmar, mentioned it once over drinks. "Never seen them at my counter," he said. "Not once. But they're selling more pies than I can count. Where's all that meat coming from?" His drinking companion raised a brow. "Maybe they've got a secret supplier." "Then why is no one else buying from him?" No one could answer that. The sheriff's interest. Sheriff Dupuy was not a man given to superstition, but he was a man who noticed patterns, and lately too many small patterns were forming a bigger, darker picture. A traveling salesman had gone missing the week the sisters arrived. He'd been heading downriver toward New Orleans, but never checked in at the next town. His horse had been found grazing near the Belmar ferry, his wagon abandoned. Now the livestock reports were piling up, and all the while, the sisters were thriving, always smiling faintly behind their counter, always closing the shop precisely at 8 o'clock, no matter how many customers were knocking. The sheriff began to watch them more closely. Night moves. One evening, just after the sun dipped below the cypress trees, Sheriff Dupuy lingered near the far end of the street, his hat pulled low. From there he could see the shop's back entrance, framed by the dim glow of an oil lamp. The shorter sister emerged, carrying something wrapped tightly in cloth. She glanced around before setting it into a small handcart and wheeling it toward the alley. The sheriff followed at a distance, careful to keep his boots silent on the damp cobblestones. She stopped at the cellar door, unlocked it, and disappeared inside with the bundle. He waited. 5 minutes. 10. Finally, she reemerged, her hands empty. She did not look around this time. She simply locked the door and went back inside. The sheriff's conclusion. The next morning, the sheriff sat alone in his office, staring at a map of the parish. The salesman's last confirmed stop. The missing livestock farms. The sister's shop, right in the middle of it all. He picked up the missing persons report again. The description of the salesman, tall, broad-shouldered, with a noticeable limp, matched something he'd heard just yesterday. An old dockhand had been eating one of the sisters' pies when he'd laughed and said, "Meat's got a good chew to it. Tough, like a man with a bad leg." The sheriff felt his stomach twist. This was no coincidence. Twist ending. Sheriff Dupuy closed the file, but the weight of it stayed with him. The sisters had come to Belmar the same week the salesman vanished. They'd opened their shop with no visible supply chain, and they had meat, plenty of it, when others were losing animals. He wasn't ready to accuse them outright. Not yet. But his eyes were open now, and in a town where everyone else was licking their fingers in bliss, he was the only one asking where the meat came from. If you knew the truth, would you still take a bite? An invitation, no, one refused. The notice appeared one bright morning on the shop's front door, written in looping, elegant French script. A celebration for the people of Belmar. Join us at the riverside this Saturday for a feast you will never forget. All are welcome. It was signed simply, Les Soeurs Boucher. No one in Belmar could remember the last time the whole town had been invited to anything. The promise of free food, especially from the sisters, sent a hum of excitement through every street. By Friday, talk of the feast had overtaken every conversation. Even those who whispered about the missing livestock and the curse found themselves curious. The feast begins. Saturday arrived under a thin veil of mist, which burned away by noon, leaving the river glittering in the sun. Long tables were set up along the grassy bank, draped in white linen and crowned with bouquets of wildflowers. At the far end, the sisters worked side by side, arranging platters and stirring steaming pots. They wore matching aprons, their dark dresses crisp and spotless despite the heat. The scent was almost unbearable. Roasted meats, spice stews, fresh bread, still warm from the oven. It drifted down the street, drawing people like a tide. By the time the church bell struck 3, the tables were full. The guests of note, among the crowd, 3 faces stood out. Etienne Carrière, a young journalist from New Orleans, had arrived in town 2 weeks ago chasing rumors of mystery sisters, with a taste for the unusual. He carried a small leather notebook everywhere, scribbling between bites. His eyes missed nothing. Widow Madeleine Arsenault, draped in black lace, had been the loudest voice warning against the sisters. She sat stiffly, her lips pressed tight, but she hadn't refused the invitation. "If they're hiding something," she told the mayor, "I intend to see it with my own eyes." Mayor Henri Vallon was the opposite, a man of booming laughter and ready appetite. He adored the sisters, claiming they had revitalized Belmar's spirit. He'd even brought a cask of wine from his personal cellar for the occasion. The first bites. The meal began with platters of bread, soft as clouds, served with whipped butter infused with herbs. People tore off chunks, their fingers brushing, the air filled with hums of approval. Then came the pies, dozens of them, each a golden crown filled with steaming meat. When Etienne took his first bite, he paused. He wasn't sure if it was the flavor or the texture that struck him first, tender, rich, layered with something he couldn't name. It was perfect, almost too perfect. Around him, others were eating with a kind of quiet reverence. The mayor laughed between mouthfuls, his face flushed. Even Widow Arsenault, after a cautious nibble, took a larger bite. Mid-scene unease. Somewhere between the third course and the arrival of a massive roast, a small group of children slipped away from a table. Etienne noticed them dart toward the open kitchen tent behind the sister station. A few minutes later, they returned. Something in their faces made him uneasy. Their eyes were wide, their mouths tight, as if they'd been scolded. One boy clutched his sister's hand so tightly his knuckles were white. No one else seemed to notice. The atmosphere shifts. The sun dipped lower, painting the river in streaks of gold. Lanterns were lit along the tables, their glow mingling with the flicker of candles stuck into tall bottles. People were eating slower now, their movements heavy. Laughter had softened into murmurs. Etienne leaned toward the boy nearest him. "What did you see?" he asked quietly. The child shook his head. Nothing. But his voice cracked, and he wouldn't meet the journalist's eyes. The collapse. It happened just as the sisters brought out the final course. A platter of sweet pastries, glazed and steaming. A man at the far end of the table, a dock worker named Julien, pushed his plate away, his brow furrowed. He swayed in his seat, one hand clutching at his chest. Then he pitched forward. The sound of his body hitting the table was muffled by the linen and drowned almost immediately by gasps. A goblet toppled, spilling red wine like blood across the cloth. The mayor was on his feet, shouting for help. Several men rushed to lift Julien, but his eyes had already gone glassy. The sisters' reaction. Through it all, the sisters stood perfectly still. The taller one watched with a calm so deep it was almost disorienting. The shorter one tilted her head slightly, as though listening for something only she could hear. When Etienne glanced at them, he was struck by the absence of shock in their expressions. It was as if they had seen this before, perhaps many times. Finally, the taller sister stepped forward. "Clear the tables," she said softly, her voice carrying over the murmurs. Let him breathe. But there was no breath to give. The aftermath. People began drifting away in uneasy clusters. The feast was over, though the tables were still heavy with untouched food. The sisters stood side by side, watching the crowd disperse. Neither spoke. Etienne closed his notebook, but did not put away. His instinct screamed that this was no accident, and that the sisters knew exactly what had just happened. Was it the food or something else? The town could not stop talking. By day, whispers curled through the marketplace like smoke from a dying fire. By night, they swelled into drunken arguments in the tavern. "Did you see her smile when that man dropped dead?" I swear there was relief in her eyes, one fisherman muttered, leaning over his mug. "Relief?" "It was satisfaction," replied the seamstress, her voice trembling. "I told you from the start, nothing good would come of women who arrive in morning clothes and start feeding us like kings." It wasn't just the death at the feast that unsettled people. It was how little it seemed to unsettle the sisters. The very next day, their shop had been open at dawn. Pies in the window, steam curling against the glass, golden crusts glistening like treasure under the early light. And still they sold out before noon. Even those who claimed to be disgusted found themselves queuing up again, coins ready, shame burning in their cheeks. The flavor was more than taste, it was a pull, an ache that made the tongue restless and the mind foggy until the craving was answered. The journalist Elias Finch had been in town less than a year, sent by a New Orleans paper to find stories of the strange and peculiar in the Louisiana backwaters. He thought at first this place would bore him. The town was small, the river slow, the people cautious. Now his notebook brimmed with half-formed suspicions. The sisters were the most peculiar thing to happen in a decade, and their sudden fame felt undeserved. Elias had spoken to the widow Clara Bellamy, a sharp-eyed woman whose husband had vanished years earlier on a hunting trip upriver. She did not smile when she warned him. "There's a curse on that inn. I've seen 3 owners before them, and none stayed more than a season. Now these 2 come along, and the whole town's bellies are theirs? It isn't right." When livestock began disappearing, goats, pigs, even a few prize hens, Elias started keeping track. The butcher confirmed the sisters never bought meat from him. Hunters swore they'd found no carcasses in the woods. So where was it coming from? One evening, just before the moon broke free of the swamp haze, Elias took a slow walk past the sister shop. Their lanterns still burned upstairs, the flickering light warping across lace curtains. From the rear of the building came a rhythmic thud, followed by the muffled scrape of metal on stone. He stepped into the shadows and waited. The sisters did not emerge, but he caught a scent, sharp, coppery, and wrong. It clung to the back of his throat, awakening an instinct older than thought. Blood. 2 nights later, Elias returned, this time prepared. His boots were wrapped in rags to soften his steps, and his coat hid a small revolver. The moon was a pale coin above the bayou, the only sound the slow gurgle of the river against its banks. He slipped behind the building, noting that the kitchen window was propped open to let out the heat. From inside came the clink of glass jars and the whisper of voices in a language he didn't recognize. Around the corner, a narrow door led to the cellar. Its wood was old, the paint flaking in strips, and it was secured with a padlock the size of a man's fist. As Elias crouched to examine it, his lantern beam caught something. Jagged marks in the frame, scratches, deep, frantic gouges, as if someone had clawed at the door from inside. His breath slowed. This wasn't the kind of thing you asked about over morning coffee. It took him nearly an hour to find way in. The lock was sturdy, but the rusted hinges on the frame gave under the steady pressure of his pry bar. The door eased open with a sigh, exhaling a breath of cold air that smelled faintly of brine and rot. The cellar was lit only by his lantern, and the walls seemed to press inward as he descended the narrow steps. The floor was damp, pitted with small puddles where water had seeped through the stone. Then he saw them. Butcher's tools, cleavers, bone saws, hooks, lined neatly on a wooden rack. Their metal edges caught the lantern light, gleaming in silent accusation. Nearby, a table was stained a deep, uneven brown. The color was unmistakable. Blood. His hand tightened on the lantern's handle. Something shifted in the shadows at the far end of the room. It was there, half hidden behind a stack of crates, a large burlap sack bound tightly with twine. It wasn't lying still, it trembled in small, uneven jerks, as though something inside was struggling weakly. Elias froze. His instinct screamed to leave, to put the door back and pretend he'd never seen this place. But the part of him that had come to Louisiana for the strange and peculiar was louder. He stepped forward, every sound amplified. The rasp of his own breath, the faint creak of the floorboards above. When he reached the sack, the movement stopped. For a heartbeat, the room was silent except for the drip of water. Then, from inside, came a noise so soft he almost thought he'd imagine it. A breath, followed by a low, broken whimper. Elias's hand hovered above the twine. The thing inside shifted again, and this time he heard the rasp of skin against coarse fabric. Human skin. His stomach clenched. He imagined the sisters upstairs, their pale faces calm and knowing. He imagined the smell of their pies sweet and rich, filling the air until it drowned out the memory of this cold, wet room. The lantern flickered. End hook. Would you open the sack? The morning after his harrowing discovery, Jonah Price sat in his small rented room above the general store, the memory of the cellar clawing at his thoughts. He had not slept, not really. He had drifted into shallow, broken dreams, where burlap sacks twitched and whispered and the smell of raw, salted flesh clung to the air. He told himself he could leave, pack his satchel, board the next steamer upriver, and never speak of this cursed place again. But the truth had its own gravity, and it was pulling him back toward the riverside inn. By late afternoon, the sun hung low, turning the bayou gold. The sisters' shop front gleamed in that light, its painted sign swaying gently in the wind. Duval Pies. Through the open doorway he saw them, Celeste and Maribel, moving gracefully among their customers, their morning gowns immaculate despite the heat. Celeste's laughter rang like a bell. Maribel's hands moved with the precision of a surgeon, as she cut thick wedges of pie. Jonah waited until the last customer left, the bell above the door giving a lonely jingle. They turned to him almost in unison, as though they had been expecting him. "You've been snooping, Mr. Price," Celeste said, her voice silk over steel. "I saw your cellar," Jonah replied, his voice lower than he intended. "I saw what's in it." A flicker of something, amusement, annoyance, passed between the sisters. Mary Bell gestured toward a back table. "Sit. We'll tell you what you've come to hear." Jonah hesitated, then sat. Celeste poured tea, her movements slow, deliberate. The scent of cinnamon and clove curled through the air, masking something else, something metallic. "You think us monsters," Celeste began, "because you've seen a few butcher's tools and sacks that squirm." "What am I supposed to think?" Jonah snapped. "You're feeding this town something unnatural." Mary Bell smiled faintly. "Oh, we are. But you misunderstand the nature of our work." They leaned closer, speaking not in whispers, but in the calm, even tone of women explaining a household recipe. "We source our meat," Celeste said, creatively. "We do not waste coin on the butcher, nor do we take from the innocent." Jonah's stomach tightened. "Creatively, we remove," Mary Bell continued, "those who poison the town in ways you cannot see. The thieves, the abusers, the men who pass through here with hands dirtier than any butcher's." Jonah stared. "You are killing people." "We are purifying," Celeste corrected, her eyes unblinking. "Tell me, Mr. Price, do you think this town would mourn the traveling salesman who lured the blacksmith's daughter? Or the drifter who left a widow bruised and bleeding? Would anyone even notice they were gone?" Jonah wanted to argue, to recoil, but the image of the salesman's slick smile came to mind, and for a moment he faltered. "You can't decide who lives and dies," he managed. Celeste's lips curved. "Someone must." They explained it plainly, without shame, how they invited certain men into their confidence, how the upstairs rooms were soundproofed, how the cellar was prepared for both slaughter and preservation. They spoke of rendering fat, of seasoning meat to perfection, of blending the forbidden with herbs so intoxicating that even the most pious townsfolk returned for seconds. "You've eaten it, haven't you?" Mary Bell asked suddenly, her eyes bright. Jonah's mind raced back to his first day in town. The flaky crust, the rich, tender filling. He felt bile rise in his throat. "This town thrives because of us," Celeste said, gesturing toward the street beyond the window. "No more theft. No more midnight screams from the alley. We've cleansed it one pie at a time." Jonah pushed back from a table. "You're insane." "Perhaps," Mary Bell said softly, "but you enjoyed every bite." The room seemed to tilt. Outside, the sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long across the floor. Celeste leaned forward, her voice a whisper meant only for him. "So tell me, Mr. Price, now that you know the truth, will you write your story, or will you come back tomorrow for another slice?" Jonah's breath caught, because even as his stomach churned with revulsion, a treacherous part of him remembered the sweetness of that first mouthful and wondered if the next would be just as divine. If evil tastes sweet, is it still evil? The Bayou's night air had a way of making thoughts heavier. Moist heat clung to the journalist's skin as if it wanted to keep him from moving forward, from thinking too much. He hadn't slept in 2 nights, not since hearing the sisters' casual confession, words spoken in the same tone one might use to describe a recipe. They had called it creative sourcing. He called it murder. And yet here he was, lingering outside their riverside shop long after closing, watching the golden candlelight flicker against the drawn curtains. Inside, faint shadows passed across the panes, their tall, lean forms moving gracefully in unison, like dancers rehearsing a silent performance. He could almost smell the buttery crusts cooling on the shelves, the rich, savory steam curling into the air. His stomach growled. His mind recoiled. The offer. The following afternoon, the sisters invited him to their private parlor. The walls smelled faintly of cinnamon and something darker. Ire, maybe. They poured him tea, their smiles warm but fixed. "You're an intelligent man," the elder sister began, her voice honey smooth. "You understand the needs of a community." The younger leaned forward. "We remove the unworthy. We feed the deserving. No one starves." Everyone wins. He tried to interrupt, but the elder raised a single-gloved finger. We're offering you a place at our table, figuratively speaking, of course. The deal was simple in their eyes. He would help identify problematic individuals, drifters, abusers, thieves, and they would handle the rest. In exchange, you would never want for food, for money, or for protection. The weight of starvation. That evening, he passed by the Johnson's shack, a family of 5 with faces drawn from hunger. The mother clutched a loaf of bread wrapped in wax paper. She whispered that the sisters had given it to her just because. No one else in town had stepped forward to help. Not the mayor, not the church, and the bread had smelled wonderful. Suspicion turns inward. 2 nights later, unable to rest, he returned to the shop under moonlight. This time, he didn't stop at the cellar door. He moved through the kitchen, past gleaming knives and spotless counters, until he reached a small writing desk tucked in the corner. Papers and ledgers lay neatly arranged. One list in particular caught his eye. It was written in looping, elegant script, names, occupations, brief notes. Some were crossed out. He recognized many of them. The traveling salesman, the drunk who had vanished last month, the butcher's apprentice who had moved away, and then near the bottom his own name. Beside it, knows too much, twist ending. The paper trembled in his hand. Somewhere above him, the floorboards creaked. A shadow passed in the gap beneath the kitchen door. He folded the list quickly, tucking it into his coat. From the darkness came the elder sister's voice, low and amused. You've had time to think about our offer. Tell us, dear, will you join us? Or will you join them? End hook. Would you take their deal or end up on their table? The town had always whispered about the sisters, but now the whispers had turned into voices, loud, angry, and impossible to ignore. Albert Green's arrival had been the match. The rumors he stirred were the dry kindling that had been waiting for a spark. Within a week, the town's peace was fractured down its middle. The meeting at Town Hall. They crammed into the old town hall, the air thick with sweat and the smell of damp coats. The mayor sat at the front, his hands folded over his belly, eyes darting between the council members and the townspeople shouting over one another. They've been here for years without trouble, the mayor said. Since they arrived, we've had steady trade, tourists, and jobs. You burn their shop, you burn your own livelihood. They're murderers, someone shouted from the back. People go missing, and they always have a roast ready the next day. They feed the hungry, another voice argued. They've kept this town afloat when the rest of the county was starving. It wasn't a debate, it was a brawl with words. The conclusion was split. Half wanted the sisters gone by sundown. The other half wanted to protect them at any cost. Cracks in the peace. By the next morning, the street outside the sisters' shop was littered with smashed pies, their sticky filling running into the gutter like blood. Someone had thrown a brick through the front window. The glass glittered on the pavement like frost. The sisters swept it up in silence, their faces calm but unreadable. That evening, protests erupted. The shouting was constant, blending into the sound of boots stomping on the cobblestones. The smell of smoke hung in the air, not from fire, but from the tension that felt ready to ignite. The mayor's dilemma. In his office, the mayor sat with his head in his hands. If he expelled the sisters, the town's fragile prosperity might collapse. But if he protected them, the anger brewing outside could turn deadly. The sisters didn't come to plead their case. They didn't need to. The mayor already knew their value. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was how far they were willing to go to keep their place here. The mob. It was close to midnight when it happened. A crowd gathered, torches and hunting rifles in hand, faces twisted with rage and fear. They moved as one, chanting for the sisters to come out. Inside the shop, the sisters locked the doors and pulled the curtains tight. The journalist stood frozen near the counter, heart pounding. He hadn't meant to be here tonight. He'd only stopped by to ask one last question about Albert Green's daughter. Now, he was trapped with them. The glass of the front door shuddered under the first blow. Someone shouted, "We know what you've done." The reveal. The elder sister turned to the crowd, her voice calm but sharp as a blade. "You think you know what we are," she said through the broken window, "but you have no idea what we've kept from you." The younger moved toward the cellar door. She placed her hand on the latch and looked back at the journalist. Her expression was almost warning. The elder continued, her voice rising above the shouts. "We could have left it to feed freely. We could have let it choose you. But we kept it. We fed it. And we kept it from the streets." The cellar door creaked as the younger began to open it. From below something shifted, heavy, wet and breathing. The mob's chanting faltered. "End hook. Do you dare see what they've been hiding?" The bayou was quiet at night, but it was never still. The journalist knew that now. How the reeds seemed to whisper to each other. How the water's surface shivered without wind. How sometimes the dark had eyes. It had been 3 weeks since the cellar thing had escaped. 3 weeks since the sisters vanished into the marsh. And in that time, the nightmares hadn't stopped. He saw them every time he closed his eyes. Not just the sisters, but what they kept. He told himself this wasn't about revenge. It was about ending it. The plan. He spent days studying their patterns from before the attack. Deliveries they made, the paths they took at night. The way their gaze always lingered on the hungry and the lonely. He knew they wouldn't return for money or threats. They'd return for him. The abandoned inn at the edge of town still stood, though its roof sagged and its shutters hung like broken limbs. He chose it because it had only one real entrance, and because the dry rot in its beams made it a perfect tinderbox. The trap was simple. Lantern oil soaked into the floorboards. Rags tucked into the cracks. A single match. All he needed was for them to come close enough. The bait. He left a trail they couldn't resist. Notes tucked into tree hollows along the bayou's edge. Written in his hand. "I know what you are. I'm not afraid. Come find me." The last note was pinned to the inn's door, smeared with a few drops of his own blood. The sisters' return. They arrived on the 3rd night. At first he only heard them. The soft press of bare feet on the wet earth. The faintest hum of a tune he half remembered from their shop. Then they stepped into the moonlight. They hadn't changed. Not in the way time changes people. Their eyes still had that still water calm. Their hands still moved with the grace of someone who'd been alive far too long. "You called us," the elder sister said. Her voice was neither angry nor pleased. It was the tone of someone already certain of the outcome. "I'm here to make it stop," the journalist said. The younger sister tilted her head, a half-smile curling at her lips. "Oh, it never stops. Not unless you stop breathing. The trap is sprung." He stepped back into the inn, leaving the door wide open. "Then come in." They followed without hesitation. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of oil. The sisters glanced around, their gaze sharp, suspicious. The elder one's eyes narrowed. "You think fire will kill us?" "I think it will kill me," he said, "and take you with me." Before they could move, he struck the match. The flames. The rags caught first, the fire racing along the soaked boards like a living thing. The sisters didn't run. They stood in the growing glow, watching him as if memorizing his face. Then, as the heat roared, their expressions changed. The elder sister's mouth twisted into something not quite human, the younger's eyes reflecting the fire in 2 perfect points of light. The journalist heard their voices rise, first in protest, then in something deeper, older, a sound that wasn't entirely screaming. The flames swallowed the room. The roof groaned, timbers snapping like bones. Aftermath. By morning, the inn was nothing but blackened beams and ash. The mayor ordered men to search the ruins, but no bodies were found, not even bones. Some said the sisters had burned to nothing. Others swore they had seen 2 shapes slip into the water before the roof fell. The journalist's notebook was recovered from the ashes, but his body was never found either. A month later, in a small river town 30 miles away, a new bakery opened. It had no sign, just a sweet scent of pastries drifting out into the street. Locals swore the pies tasted like nothing they'd ever had before. Rich, almost intoxicating. The 2 women who ran it were polite, quiet, and always smiling. When asked about their recipe, they only said, "It's an old family tradition." And hook. "Would you taste it?" They say time heals, that if you let the years wash over wounds, the scar will fade, and you will learn to forget. That's a lie. In this town, time does not heal, it ferments. Every whispered story, every half-told truth, every unspoken suspicion, it lingers, sour and swollen, just beneath the surface. And every time the wind carries the scent of fresh bread from a neighbor's oven, someone remembers. The sisters are gone. Or at least, that's what we tell ourselves. The shop is a hollow shell now. The windows boarded, the front sign splintered, the once polished brass handle rusting green with neglect. But if you walk past late at night, you can almost swear you hear movement inside. A chair scraping, a soft laugh, the faintest thud from beneath the floorboards. The town has never been the same. People no longer trust each other the way they once did. Potlucks are rare, and when they happen, eyes linger too long on the serving trays, and the first bites are taken reluctantly. The joy of eating together, gone. Even the church suppers feel tense, as if everyone's silently asking, "Do you know where this came from?" The journalist, the one who survived, if you can call it that, doesn't speak to anyone now. He sits at the far end of the diner, nursing coffee that goes cold in his hands. Some say he blames himself for what happened. Others say he still dreams about the cellar, about the things he saw, and the deals he almost made. His eyes are haunted, like he's still chewing on something he can't quite swallow. The mayor never recovered from a scandal. He resigned, disappeared into the next parish, and left behind whispers that he'd known more than he admitted, that maybe the sisters' prosperity was a bargain struck in private, that maybe the pies and the sweetbreads weren't the only thing feeding this town. And the elder, well, he died with a smirk on his lips, as if he'd carried the truth for so long that it became more precious than life itself. His last words, overheard by a nurse, were, "They'll be back." Because here's the thing about hunger. It doesn't die. You can burn it, bury it, drown it, and still, it finds a way to return. Sometimes it takes the shape of a craving, sometimes a curse, sometimes two women with flour on their aprons and blood on their hands. I've asked myself more times than I can count whether we should have stopped them sooner, whether we could have. The honest answer? I don't know, because in some twisted way, they did help people. The starving family they fed, the debts they paid off in pies, the old widower who swore their stew cured his illness. But at what cost? Maybe that's the most dangerous kind of evil, the kind that makes you believe it's doing good, the kind that smiles as it hands you a plate, knowing full well that with each bite, you're becoming just like them. There are those who swear the sisters weren't entirely human, that their blood carried the memory of every person they'd ever consumed, that when they looked at you, they saw your value not in your heart or your soul, but in the tenderness of your flesh. That's the part that keeps me up at night, wondering if, when they smiled at me, they were measuring me for the oven. The town has moved on, at least on the surface. The children play, the shops open each morning. The fishermen still haul their catch from the bayou. But something's changed in our bones, something that makes our smiles thinner and our trust shorter. And then there's the letter. It arrived last month, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in looping, elegant script. Just 4 words. "We're baking again. Soon." There was no signature, but the faintest trace of something clung to the paper. A scent. Sweet, warm, and familiar. I keep it locked away, but sometimes late at night I take it out and hold it close. I don't know why. Maybe I'm trying to prepare myself. Maybe I'm trying to remember exactly what they smelled like. Maybe. And this is the part when I don't want to admit maybe I miss it. Because here's the truth no one likes to say out loud. Hunger makes monsters of us all. And if they come again, we'll eat.